Sounds like the rain is just starting to come down, which is good, because I've got lots of great tales for you today. Welcome to Cozy Horror, with me, Dr. Plague. I've got 5 great stories for you today, and they're some of my favorites, so I hope they'll be some of yours very soon. We all have things that we sometimes have to go to therapy for, problems in our past, problems in our present, maybe even things that could become problems in our future. But sometimes, and not often but sometimes, the therapy becomes the problem, especially when there's a chance we might become a captive god. You'll have to bear with me while I tell you my story. So much of it is written from the hazy recollections of someone who was in captivity. Don't misunderstand. I wasn't abused in the traditional sense. I was well kept, I was well fed, and I really wanted for nothing except my freedom. It all started one day when I visited a new therapist. Dr. McAllister had been recommended by a friend of mine. He said he was very good, and he'd helped him get through a lot of issues that he had with his mother and discover some things about his sexuality. He put you under and put you in touch with your real self, and that was how he overcame a lot of your issues. It all sounded great to me. I'd been having trouble sleeping and was looking for some way to get the sleep I needed to function. My insomnia would sometimes last for days, and it was starting to affect my life. So I made an appointment, and 2 weeks later I was lying on his couch, listening to Dr. McAllister count down from 10 as he put me in a suggestive trance. It was very sudden, like blinking, but everything changed after that trance. When I came out just as suddenly, Dr. McAllister looked strange, and I asked if something had happened. Strange may not be descriptive enough. He looked somehow enraptured, enlightened, utterly worshipful. You spoke to me about things you couldn't possibly have known. You talked to me about my childhood. You helped me get over the death of my mother. You helped me more in this hour-long session than I've ever helped anyone. I wasn't sure what he was talking about, but when he gripped my hand, his eyes shone like the lights of a zealot. I need more. Please let me put you back under, so I can discover more. I pulled away from him and took a huge step back. What the hell was he talking about? I had come here for help, but suddenly he wanted me to help him. I had to get out of here. I had to leave now. McAllister tried to stop me, but I was out the door before he could say much more than stop. I didn't sleep well that night either. It was becoming a real problem. Sometimes I would lay in bed and swear I heard whispers, but I put it off as auditory hallucinations. I hadn't slept well in the past 3 weeks, and I knew it was something that would catch up to me eventually. When I would force myself out of the house for work or to run errands, I could swear I felt someone watching me. What's more, I could swear I'd catch glimpses of someone from the corner of my eye, but they would always be gone when I turned to look at them. It never happened in my house, always when I was out and about, and the paranoia on top of the sleep deprivation was slowly eroding my sanity. So, when I heard someone open a window in my living room one night, I rolled over and just thought it was me having paranoid hallucinations. Turned out, it hadn't been a hallucination. When I heard someone open my bedroom door, I rolled over and found Dr. McAllister standing there watching me. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well either, and his eyes looked crazed as we stood staring at each other. I wasn't sure if he was real or not, but when he lunged at me, I curled into a ball and cried out for him to stop. He didn't attack me, though. He didn't hurt me at all, though now I wish he'd killed me right there. Instead, he just slipped a needle into my arm, and I watched his thumb push down the plunger as I felt a wave of warm and inviting sleep roll through me. I woke up in a finished basement, the lights turned down low, strapped to a chair as Dr. McAllister made sure my bindings were comfortable. I struggled, my limbs heavy and uncoordinated, but he held up a fresh needle and told me if I didn't calm down, he was going to put me out again. I made myself as still as I could, not sure what to expect here. This didn't seem to be a sexual thing. I was fully dressed, and the way he was tending to me almost felt worshipful. I didn't want it to come to this, but I can't live without the knowledge you possess. I know you don't believe what I'm saying, but while you were unconscious, you told me about things that may very well change my life. You spoke to me of things that opened my eyes, ideas I had never even conceived of, and the longer I went without hearing your voice again, the more I felt my newfound security crumbling. I'm sorry, I'm not usually like this, but I had to possess you, to have your knowledge, to understand your words. I can promise you that while you remain with me, you'll want for nothing. You are to me as a captured god that I wish to understand. We talked a lot that night, though I mostly yelled at him to let me go. In the end, though, he just injected me with something to knock me out, and I drifted off into a peaceful unconsciousness. And that was how I became Dr. McAllister's captive god. I will say that while I was with him, I never wanted for restful sleep. This was due in part to the fact that I spent most of my time in a near catatonic state. Dr. McAllister kept me restrained in a large underground area that I always thought of as the basement. I was seated in a large, comfortable chair, my hands secured to the arms with soft straps. There was a remote at hand, and I was allowed to watch anything I wanted on television, as long as the doctor was away. If I was hungry, all I had to do was push a button, and a short blonde woman, who I would later discover was the doctor's wife, would bring me anything I wanted. In the beginning, it really wasn't so bad. I was kept in a sluggish state from the drugs he used on me to induce the state that he wanted, but it wasn't bad. I watched TV, I ate, I existed. Given that I had worked 40-plus hours a week and lived off crappy food for most of my adult life, I felt almost like I was being pampered. I was free to relax. I could do almost anything, except leave or talk to people who were likely to wonder what had happened to me. My mom, my dad, my friends. I wondered if any of them wondered what had happened to me. It may seem odd to you that I never tried to escape, but my head was always in a cloud of some sort. The drugs left me just lucid enough to consume TV or audiobooks, but I never felt able to really settle my thoughts on anything in particular. I knew I should want to escape, but it was always a hard concept to catch hold of. Those days were the good days, back when Dr. McAllister was still operating his practice. That was when he was still pretending to have a normal life. He would come down in the evenings to talk with me, just telling me his problems and asking me to help. He would ask me about stocks or bonds, the housing market, business ideas, patents, inventions, and I would try my best to direct him in the way he wanted. I wasn't really sure what he wanted. My head was too foggy most of the time to make sense of it, but I would try my best to help him without the need to be placed in an unconscious state. We'd talk for hours about everything from the state of his marriage, the depraved childhood he had lived through, the future of psychology, and even the condition of his soul. I didn't always want to hear what he had to say, but I understood that it didn't really matter what I wanted. It didn't seem to make much of a difference anyway. We would talk for hours, but the end result was always a needle in my arm or my neck, and several hours of blissful unconsciousness. I remember little from these periods of blackout, fortunately, but sometimes I would go to a dark place and just hang suspended in the murk. Things would whisper to me there, tell me things I couldn't understand. I was powerless to stop them. This happened very rarely, but it was still too often for my tastes. I don't know what I said to Dr. McAllister in those times, but there was always a drastic change when I came back to myself. It wasn't always for the better either. Once I came back to myself and felt something wet in my lap. I glanced down, which was difficult because my head was strapped to the headrest, and found that someone had thrown a head into my lap. I flinched away from it as my groggy brain finally clicked it all together, but it was little more than a shudder in my current state. The head had wispy gray hair, a pair of broken glasses hanging across the face from one ear, and a nose full of broken veins from a lifetime of drinking. I didn't recognize it, but as it soaked the pants of my pajamas, I did feel like it was familiar somehow. Dr. McAllister was sitting across from me, looking expectantly at the gift he had literally dropped in my lap, and I looked at it with confusion as I asked why he had done this. You told me to. You said if I meant to truly get over the cruelty and abuse that my father had given me, then I had to destroy the icon of my father within myself. So I did. I told him that I wanted to meet so we could discuss our past and reconcile. He was ecstatic. He hadn't seen me in 20 years, and oh, did we reconcile. I waited for him to turn around, and I bashed his head in with a hammer, choking him to death as he lay twitching on the floor. Then I took the body and disposed of it, cutting the head off so I could show you that I'd followed your instructions. You're so wise, so correct. I am your loyal disciple, always. I started screaming, mindless, gibbering noise, but he just bowed to me, and when the head hit the ground next to him, he didn't even flinch. That was my first inclination that the things I was saying in my sleep might be used in this way, in ways that I had never considered. After that, he started bringing people down to see me. At first, it was his wife, the blonde woman who'd been feeding me. She looked skeptical as she approached, content to keep her husband's secrets, but unsure of joining him in this new experiment. I knew from our talks that he was afraid she would leave him, but enjoyed the financial stability of their marriage. He stuck me with the needle as she sat a few feet away, and when I came to, she was bowing and crying and thanking me for helping her see the truth. My husband was right. You are truly a god. I was wrong to ever doubt you, or him. After that, it was friends and colleagues. They all seemed confused when he introduced them to me, calling me his god of knowledge. And some of them laughed, thinking it was a joke. They would sit and talk to me, listening to my answers and looking at McAllister as if to ask if this were an elaborate prank. In the end, though, when I came back from the little nap he would subject me to, it was always the same. Their smirks of disbelief or scowls of confusion were replaced with rapturous awe, and they would pledge their undying fealty to me. No matter how many of them I begged to release me, the outcome was always the same. A religion of sorts began to form. Over time, McAllister drew in his cult. It was only a few at first, 5, 10, but it quickly grew into a sizable little flock. The followers began to take care of me, washing and feeding and seeing to my every whim, except the most important. I would ask them to release me, beg them to let me go, but it was always interpreted as a test of some sort. Their God was testing them to see if they were loyal to the here or to the hereafter, and they would thank me for helping them fortify their belief in me as they slid my hands back into the restraints or pushed my head back into the buckles. I yelled at them. I called them idiots. I tried to push them, but the constant use of sedatives and the lack of any regular exercise had made me weak. I wasn't wasting away, but I wasn't getting the exercise I needed, to be certain. I could do little to free myself. My bonds always replaced, and after a while I just gave in. The funny thing was that whatever I was telling them while I was under was working. McAllister showed me the money he had made, earned from the stock market and selling property, and the cult began to thrive. What's more, they all claimed to have cast off whatever addictions or mental health problems or childhood traumas had plagued them, and they were addicted now to nothing but serving me. Like McAllister had said, those who tried to leave or to return to their lives reported feeling hopeless and manic unless they could return to my presence and hear my words, whatever they were. That's when things started to get bad. McAllister was truly addicted to my influence, and it led him to overstep. McAllister had been gathering his followers at his home, and while it was large, it was becoming too small to hold all of them. Can't really speculate how many there were, but the basement was standing room only. I sat beneath a small bar that he was standing on, and the sea of bodies was dizzying. Though he was speaking, they all looked at me as if I were speaking through him. So many eyes looking at me. My body still held in the chair I had sat in for God knew how long. It was something I never quite got used to. It never made me feel like a deity. It never made me feel powerful to have them worship me. It always made me feel like a pet, my freedom just one open door away. McAllister said they'd be moving to a new place soon, a place that would house them all comfortably. They could all stay there indefinitely, leaving their jobs and lives behind so they could care for their captive God. He didn't say where it was, but he said they would all go this afternoon and prepare for a long journey. They were all so happy, their faces enraptured as he told them about their new home. But I began to feel that this would never end. When he began to bring people to see me, I had hoped that someone would fail to see me as he did and get me out of here. They would take me away from him. They would call the police, and I would be saved from my captivity. That never happened. Whatever power I had held them in sway, and after a while I doubted that I would ever get out of here. I didn't know how long I had been McAllister's captive God, but I knew that no matter how comfortable the life, this had to end. I decided then that if they weren't going to get me out, I would have to do it myself. Strangely, my chance came that very day. They had all left me so they could prepare, and as I sat in the shadowy basement, I realized that my wrist strap was undone. This had never happened before. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to do. It took all the energy I had to focus enough to get my hand to undo the other strap. And when I bent down to undo my legs, the effort seemed to take years. My mind was like unraveling yarn, and it was hard to focus on any particular task. When the bonds came off my legs, I got shakily to my feet before bending to rub some life into them. They were prickly from the lack of use, and I took shaky steps as I made for the stairs. I got to the top before I was discovered. I peeked through the door and into the barren kitchen beyond. The The cupboards were empty, the countertops clean, and I could tell that this room had already been cleaned out for the move. I had just decided to take a step out and make for the back door when someone walked into the kitchen and saw me. They called for McAllister, walking to me as they insisted I return to my chair. I pushed at them, telling them to get away from me, to get out of my way, but as I lunged for the back door, I heard others coming in to stop me. I made it to the backyard, squinting at the sun as it hit my eyes, but I found it fenced with tall wooden boards. I was grabbed by many hands, and when someone slipped a needle into my neck, I looked back to see McAllister instruct them to get me in the car. I came to some time later, and I was laying in an elaborate bed, my hands cuffed to the frame. That began the worst part of my confinement, though it was thankfully the end of it. After that, the drugging became worse. McAllister and his inner circle kept me in a near constant catatonic state. The drugs he used were no longer just injected, and they began to experiment with other substances. The documents that were found later said they received different outcomes when different kinds of drugs were used, and they often sat around and drank or laughed as I came in and out of reality. I was aware of nothing in those times. A ship drifting on a sea of time. I could have been with them for days. I could have spent decades under their control. But to me, time was only islands glimpsed from afar. I didn't see many people in that time, just the 5 or so who were in McAllister's inner circle. But these men always spoke as if they were doing very well. Often there was cigar smoke around my bed, the smell of expensive liquor, and always the low murmur of talk as they waited for me to tell them what else they might do to gain more power. I'd become their oracle, their captive god as opposed to their revered deity, and they threatened to use me up. These are the times I remember the least about, except for the end. I spent a lot of my days in a black stupor, and the more they experimented, the more often I was back in the dark place. When I came back from these trances, I noticed a change in my captors. Gone were the shining eyes of the enraptured. Disappeared were the weeping orbs of the enlightened. They were replaced by the flinty eyes of the zealot, and I was afraid that he might break his promise. He looked angry, but also resolved. Whatever I had told him weighed heavily on him, but I wouldn't understand the burden, not for a while yet. Not until the day it all came to an end. I came to one afternoon to find an intrusive light leaking into my dark chamber. They had always kept me in this persistent dark room, but now the door was open, and something was laying in it. On the floor, there were others, none of them moving, and I was confused by their sudden stillness. Was this something new? Were they sleeping, or were they... I tried to put that thought out of my head. They couldn't be dead, I reminded myself as I shook my chains. If they were all dead, then who would free me so I didn't die here too? I did as you said, came a monotone voice, and I jumped as I realized that one of the slumped forms had only been praying. It was McAllister. He looked wild. His salt and pepper hair was sticking up at odd angles, and his face was splattered with blood. His shirt was soaked in something as it hung on him like a wet sack. He appeared to be praying, but as something clinked in his shaky hands, I saw that he held a gun. I was afraid that he would shoot me too for half a second, but as he put it under his chin, I became even more afraid that he would use it on himself. I have risen as high as I can. Your will dictates that I must shed my vehicle to rise any higher. I shall see you on the other side. His blood made a crimson line across my face as the gun went off. And suddenly, My fears were realized. I was alone. Luckily for me, someone heard the gunshot. I would lay in that bed for 2 days before the FBI came to investigate the compound. Turned out they'd been keeping an eye on McAllister for quite some time, ever since he had started gathering followers at his home. After 2 years in his new compound, they had begun to try to prepare a case against him, before he woke up one morning and decided to put an end to his little flock. With the help of his wife, they had poisoned the morning meal, and McAllister had drawn his inner circle to a meeting before breakfast. That's where he shot them, as they sat listening to my latest ramblings. They had found journals that claimed there were things I had told them, but after interviewing me, I think they decided that he was out of his mind. At least, that's what Agent Maxit led me to believe. We're going to have to hold you as a person of interest, but it honestly sounds like you were an unwilling participant. I'm going to go and get some things in order. Have a seat. We'll make some accommodations for you. After he left, I noticed the recorder sitting on the table. It wasn't running, which I had expected, and when I reached for it, I saw the tape inside had a date on it that I remembered. It was the date of my first session with Dr. McAllister. Couldn't imagine a reason behind the FBI having a tape with that date on it, unless McAllister had recorded it for some reason. I put the recorder back down, trying to stop my curiosity before it could take root. I had never heard what I sounded like in that state that seemed to enrapture the old doctor so much. What had I said to him to make him throw his whole life away in the pursuit of it? I couldn't help myself. I hit play on the recorder and listened as McAllister told me to be calm and began to count down from 10. It wasn't the jagged, often flighty voice I remembered from any time after his session. This was McAllister at his most sane, and as he came to 1, I heard him gasp and ask what I was doing. From the recording, I heard a slightly deeper version of my own voice, and it filled me with dread. Agent Maxit has been listening to the tapes. He's becoming as unstable as the good doctor. If you don't escape now, I fear that he'll have you just like McAllister did. You'll have to be quick, and you'll have to be smart. But if you mean to be free, you need to find a way out of here. Good luck. Another day, another rainstorm. I might have to call the weather service and get them to put my home down as a weather anomaly. I seem to get more rain here than I've ever seen anywhere else. We've all got a favorite show from when we were a kid. Mine was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but there were a lot of live-action shows, a lot of game shows, a lot of shows with people trying to complete tasks and win things. Let's explore one of those shows, as talked about by our storyteller today, as we watch Children of Men for the first time. I pulled up in front of the shop and had to recheck my directions. It was a dingy little hole-in-the-wall place between a Dollar General and a computer repair shop. It looked like it had just existed here since the creation of the first VHS tape. The windows were covered in thick yellow paper, and the outside was caked with a film of old dirt. The sign on the door read "Open," but it was barely visible through the dirty windows. There was no way this place was what I wanted. When I was a kid, I remember watching a show called Children of Man. As a kid, the premise of the show appealed to me. The show was all about kids living on an island in the Pacific, trying to survive day-to-day trials. The producers had gotten about 40 kids from all over America, ages 10 to 12, and dropped them off with supplies and instructions on how to survive. The host, Chris Mansworth, was a survival expert, and he would create challenges every day for the kids to complete. There were 4 teams of 10 kids, and the winner of each challenge got something cool for their area of the village. I watched the show religiously as a kid. Every Saturday night, right after The Simpsons, the show would come on, and I would be enthralled. I always imagined that I was on the island with them, surviving day to day. The challenges were really neat, too. They had kids gut and clean their own meat, dig wells by hand, build rafts for raft races, and make aqueducts so their village could have running water. It was a neat idea, but after 8 episodes, the show just kind of stopped. No new episodes came out, and the station never gave a reason. This was before the internet, so there was no way to check on updates online. So the show slipped off into obscurity, and my 10-year-old self just kind of forgot about it. I remembered the show again a few years ago, when Mom sent me a box of stuff from the attic. There were a couple of old VHS tapes in there, and between Batman, the animated series, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, were 8 tapes with handwritten labels that read Children of Men. We had a VHS recorder when I was a kid, and I can remember recording my favorite shows to watch later. I was excited to get to see the old show again, the memories flooding back as I started looking for the VHS player amongst the tapes in the box. There wasn't one, but a quick trip to Goodwill and $15, and I had a gently used VCR hooked up to my TV. I watched all 8 episodes back to back and fell in love with the show all over again. I remembered the kids I liked. Robert and Catherine were my favorites, but many of the kids had also been given a lot of screen time, and it was hard not to like them too. As I watched, I found myself wanting to see how the show ended over and over again. As I watched the show, I began to notice something a little darker under the surface too, something I hadn't noticed as a kid. The village was divided into 4 teams: green snakes, bluebirds, red foxes, and brown mice. The teams had been divided up by background mostly, and it seemed very divisive to me as an adult. The green snakes did most of the hunting for the village, a lot of their kids having a rural background, while the brown mice did most of the farming and gathering because they came from a farm background. The red foxes were in charge of construction and upkeep. They were the smart kids, and they worked with the bluebirds, who were in charge of food management and cooking the meals. Every team had a representative who sat on a council. Robert was for the green snakes, Catherine for the bluebirds, Marco for the red foxes, and Shireen for the brown mice. As the show went on, it became very apparent that Robert didn't trust Marco, and with good reason. Marco and Shireen had formed a kind of alliance on their own, most of it because Marco bullied her into doing what he wanted. Robert and Catherine set up their own alliance, and Robert started holding out food to sway Shireen's decision. The village needed food, and Robert pointed out that he and Catherine were the ones providing it. Robert and Shireen wanted a fair split for everyone, but Marco tried to split them into class systems that would put his foxes at a higher tier. Robert didn't like that, and it became very clear that if Chris hadn't been there would have been a lot more fighting. Robert was a big 12-year-old, a stocky bruiser who won battles with his fists most of the time, and Chris had to separate him and Marco on more than one occasion. Marco was smaller, but definitely had charisma. He had most of the mice and all of the foxes on his side, and I wasn't sure how I missed all of this tension as a kid. It all came to a head on episode 6. Marco was caught hoarding food in the Red Fox village. It wasn't just food that the other teams had been bringing in either. He had been taking the comfort foods from the canteen the brown mice ran for the village and storing them in his hut. Robert discovered this and took Marco prisoner, demanding that he be placed on trial. The whole village was in an uproar, but Marco agreed to be confined to a central cabin until the council could rule on his trial. Chris was setting the whole trial up as an episode 8 for the viewers. At the end of episode 8, the council found Marco guilty, and the episode was ended with a lot of shaky camera work and the red foxes storming the podium where Marco was seated. That was how the show had ended. The little bell chimed overhead as I stepped into the tiny place. The store looked like a throwback. Sharp-looking rickety shelves that were covered in plastic VHS boxes and dust. The shelves held VHS tapes, Betamax, and DVD cases that were arranged neatly amongst the filth and dust. A quick look showed that they were all arranged alphabetically, like an ancient library of some sort. The shelves fronted onto a glass display case that held murky wonders within. On the counter was a TV, an ashtray stacked with old butts, and a greasy store clerk who smiled at me as I approached. "You the one who called about the tape?" he asked, showing a mouthful of stained teeth as he smiled. I had searched for months on my own. I had taken to the internet in an attempt to find something, anything that would give me some closure. Wikipedia told me that only 8 episodes were aired, but that 12 had been intended. I dug deeper and began to see that the show was a mystery all its own. The list of children that had been on the show was woefully incomplete. Marco and Robert were there, so were Catherine and Shireen, and Chris was there as the host, but none of the other children were named. No one except Chris Mansworth had gone on to do anything after the show, and his only contribution was his death a few months later. His Wikipedia said that he had committed suicide in his hotel room, and foul play was not suspected. As for the last 4 episodes of Children of Man, however, there was no mention. So I took to the usual online sleuths, Reddit, 4chan, TV message boards, but no one seemed to have the answer. Most people had never even heard of Children of Man, and the ones that had were more interested in my copies than the last 4 episodes. Apparently the episodes were never compiled or released for purchase, and the only means by which you could still see them were on VHS tapes like mine. I had several offers for them. One guy wanted to give me $500 per tape, but I declined and told him I'd post copies of the tapes for free if they wanted. That's how I met Charleston Hammer 462. He was a user on the hometown board of Reddit. He saw my post and the posted videos and got in contact with me about the place I was currently in. Heard you were looking for a certain tape. In my line of work, when you're looking for something, you go talk to Reggie. He owns a shop in Burlington, South Carolina called Video Time Capsule. If you need a banned episode of a 70s drama or a never-aired documentary from the 60s, you talk to Reggie. I read the message a few times before responding. Thanks, Charleston, but these episodes aren't just unaired. They're unknown. No one has ever seen them. I don't even know if they exist. And the store you're talking about is 400 miles away. When I hit send on the message, I figured I'd never hear from him again. It took him an hour to respond, but he got back with me. What you're after is very rare. I used to watch Children of Man myself when I was younger. It ended so abruptly that it's been an internet mystery since the net was just message boards and wells. I didn't learn about the last 4 episodes, though, until I met Reggie at TVCon. We got to talking about old TV shows, and after a few drinks, he told me he had the last 4 episodes of Children of Men. I perked up. Have you seen them? That response took a little longer. I have. It's some pretty different stuff. I won't ruin it for you, but if you value the way you remember the show, don't watch it. There's a reason these episodes never made it to air. Here's the number to the store. If it's late, call him anyway. Reggie keeps weird hours, and sometimes that store's open 24 hours a day. He's an eccentric dude, don't doubt, but he has what you're looking for. The number was at the bottom of the message. Yeah, I said, no longer quite sure what I was doing here. Yeah, I called about the complete series of Children of Men. He nodded, reached under the counter, and slapped a plain white case onto it. All 8 episodes, recorded as aired, he said, studying me. I frowned. I'm after the last 4 episodes. His piggy eyes glinted behind the grease-smeared glasses. There were only 8 episodes aired. And you told me you had the other 4 that never aired. He smiled, and it did ghastly things to his porcine face. Had to make sure. Come to the back. And with that, he disappeared behind the curtain into the back room. I walked around, hesitating for a moment as I touched the curtain, and followed him. I'd come 400 miles, might as well go 5 feet into hell. The phone rang 6 times. I was just about to hang up when someone answered and spoke through a mouthful of food. I didn't understand him, but once he'd swallowed whatever he'd had in his mouth, he tried again. Video Time Capsule, where your memories are always on sale. What a tagline. Yes, I'm looking for something specific. The sound of something being stuffed into the speaker's mouth and chewed loudly assaulted my ears as he continued. Aren't they all? What you looking for? Clearly, customer service was not his strong suit. Episodes 9 through 12 of Children of Man. I heard something hit the floor, and the speaker cursed loudly. Yeah, you must be mistaken. There are only 8 episodes of Children of Man. Look, I said a little hotly, I was told that you have things that no one else does. I want to see those episodes. I don't even want to buy them. I was just told that you have them in your possession. Is there any way that I can just... $500, the voice returned, and the tone was not to be bargained with. In cash, before I will even let you see them. I agreed, despite the outrageous price, and now I was here in the grungy shop, preparing to go into the back. The back was worse than the front. DVDs and VHS tapes were stacked into teetering piles. The back room was lit by only a few dingy overheads, and I could see an old TV casting its glow from the back. The floor was riddled with trash, and I swear you could hear the mice scampering around to get out of my way. What sort of videos could you find in here? Would this place give me anything but heartbreak? This seemed like the setup for 1,000 scary stories, and I suddenly didn't want to see these mysterious artifacts. but like anyone else who comes to find things that they want, I needed to see them. Reggie was waiting by the TV. He had an ancient set that looked very similar to the one my parents had owned. On top of it was a VHS DVD combo player that had a set of rabbit ears stuck out of it like a weather vane. There was a wooden chair in front of it with a little blue pad on it. Reggie held up a hand. $500, he said. I reached into my pocket, but I paused. How do I know it's authentic? Look, I could get into a lot of trouble for even owning this, okay? You think guys who possess child porn go to prison for a long time? This would put me under the prison for life. If you want to see those episodes, then I need the money. Are we doing business or what? I handed him the money, and he popped the cassette tape in and walked away. Not joining me, I asked. Not for another $500, kid. I heard the curtains rustle, and the show began. Episode 9 gave us a recap of the trial, and then the storming of the stage. When the show started, I noticed a distinct lapse in the film quality. Whoever was operating the camera was just shorter than the usual crew members, and they seemed barely able to lift the heavy rig. Finally, the camera had Robert in frame, and he began to fill us in on what was happening in the village. It's been about 3 days since Marco's trial and his escape. Since then, Fox Village has been separated from our village. They took most of the brown mice with them, and now they're trying to raid us every night for food. Something's going on over there. We heard shouts this morning, and at that point, the shouts got louder, and Robert ran off screen as the camera tried to follow him. We came to the edge of Red Fox Village. Many of the huts that were once on the verge had been burnt out, making a kind of barricade between them and the rest of the village. Many voices were cheering as something swung from the tree. At first, I thought it was just an effigy, a dummy maybe, but then suddenly I realized it was Shireen. She hung like a grotesque wind chime in the space between the villages, and Robert shouted for Marco to stop being a coward and come out. Some of the kids were crying, but everyone on the other side cheered and shouted, "Traitor!" or "Faithless!" at the swinging body of Shireen. I sat glued to the TV, unsure if any of this was even real. It was night when the next recording resumed. It seemed that whoever was running the camera wanted us to see a raid. The night vision on the camera showed kids with torches fighting other kids who were leaving their storehouse in a hurry. The kids with torches hacked at them with machetes, blood flying as they connected, and some of them dropped as they were stabbed or hacked to pieces by the blades of the other children. The rest of the episode was mostly uneventful. Lots of shaky cam, lots of crying, and at one point someone dropped it and didn't pick it up again for several minutes. As the episode ended, I was left looking at my own stark face looking back at me. What had I just watched? There was no way this could be the same show. Things had gone very Lord of the Flies in the village, and as the 10th episode started, I wasn't sure what to expect. Episode 10 started without preamble. There was no recap, no theme music, and the footage looked unedited. We see a much more professional camera crew, and Chris Mansworth trying to bring some order back to the island. They're coming up through the shallows, Chris and about 10 adults, coming up in the dark towards the village. Chris was talking about how it had all gotten so out of hand, and how he was going to try to rescue the kids. As they came into the seemingly empty village, Chris cupped his hands and began to shout at the empty huts. He told them that the game was over, and that it was time they went home. He told them that there was a boat that would take them home, but there was still no response. He moved deeper into the collection of straw huts, the fires burning low around him, and that was when they struck. Kids with spears, kids with machetes, came screaming out of the darkness, and the cameramen backpedaled furiously as the adults were completely taken by surprise. Blood flew, legs were sawed off as pint-sized pygmies, hacked and chopped, and Chris Mansworth was buried under a pile of children as he screamed and flailed. As the cameraman tripped and went down, we see the shadow of a child standing over him as the spear comes down as well. The episode ended very abruptly. I was speechless. What the hell had happened to them? These were kids that had been doing challenges and making friends. The rivalry between Robert and Marco had always been the most serious part of the show, but now they had devolved into savagery. The 11th episode was about 10 minutes long. It opened on a stationary camera shot of the same space where they had held the trial. Marco was on his knees before the camera, and he looked bad. His left eye was a puffy mass of bruised tissue. His left ear was a bleeding stump. His nose looked to be cut jaggedly. He was weeping silently. and his tears were thick and bloody. Robert stood behind him. He had always worn a white football jersey in every episode I'd seen him in, but the garment was stained red and brown now. He bled from several places on his chest, and when he raised his machete, it was with obvious pain. This morning, before the sun had risen, this dog attempted to attack our village. He violated the rules of war as agreed upon by he and I. We agreed to a battle between our two villages at dawn. This snake tried to attack us in the night and lost. Thus his village is forfeit. As the winner, I sentence him to death. Please, Robert, Mansworth said, his voice off screen. The show's over. We can all go home now, back to your parents. It doesn't have to end like this. As Marco cried his terrible tears, Robert looked at Chris off screen and turned back to his enemy. The show is over. This is our home now. He brought the machete down. Marco cried out and fell face first onto the ground. Robert fell on him, hitting him with the machete again and again. Blood sprayed from the struggling child, and when Robert looked back at the camera, his face was spattered with gore. He reached out, and the camera went off abruptly. The last episode was only a few minutes. It started with a shaky cam journey through the jungle. The runner was being pursued. I could hear the footsteps behind him. As the runner got to the shore, he jumped onto something and pushed it into the water. The wooden deck of a boat came into view, and as he drifted out, I could hear oars working in the water. He sat the camera on the seat as he rowed, and the faces of children could be seen in the surrounding jungle. Then, everything went dark. The tape clicked, and the TV went back to static. I left it in the VCR and stumbled out of the back room. Reggie was sitting behind the counter and looked up at me with something like sympathy. He held something back towards me, and I saw it was my money. I shook my head and stepped away from him. I had bought a ticket, and I had paid the price. You okay? Yeah, so what happened to the kids? They just left them there? Reggie shrugged. Coast Guard picked up Mansworth about 2 days later. He was drifting in the ocean and looked extremely rattled. He wouldn't tell them how he had gotten out there or where he had been. When he got back, he gave the tapes to the studio, and the next time anyone saw him, he was dead. And the kids? The studio never pursued the show, never sold the aired episodes. They never even tried to air what Chris had brought back. They just made the whole thing disappear. I suppose there's an island out there full of kids who wanted to be on a TV show and just never came back. Their parents were likely told there had been an accident or something. The whole thing was hushed up, and eventually people forgot. You'll forget one day, too, he added, as though he thought it might help. As I lay in bed now, trying to forget the horrible things I saw, I hope I do forget, but I doubt I ever will. So if you ever find an island out in the Pacific, maybe one full of locals that look just a little not right, turn your boat back out of sight. Those natives are not friendly. Days like this, it's hard not to just curl back up and go back to bed. Rainy days were made for naps, for being cozy, and for listening to great stories. We all have things we want, things we need, things that would make us happy. Well, if you're seeking something particular, might I recommend the location of our next great story? Though the cost may not be worth what you find. So, I hope you've got gas in the car. Let's take a trip down to Bright Farm. And so, we commit Malcolm Tyler to the earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The dirt hit the top of the child-sized coffin as it slid into its final resting place. John just sat there, surrounded by family and friends, yet utterly alone. Malcolm had been 10, on the cusp of the age of reason. As John looked at the picture of his departed son, he could swear it was one of his own baby pictures. Malcolm had loved baseball, superheroes, Star Wars, and old video games. He had clung to his father's passions, and the two had always been close. As he watched the coffin slip into the earth, John felt the tears slide down his face. They were naked and unashamed. The seat next to him was empty. His wife, Claire, was still in the hospital after the accident that had taken their son. The doctor had told him that she would likely recover, but she might never walk again. They had told him this as though it were a spectacular consolation prize. Your son will never play in the majors or even see the Star Wars movie he was looking forward to, but you can rest assured that your now crippled wife will be home as soon as we're done milking your insurance for all it's worth. He sat there and accepted the pats, the condolences, the meaningless words that fell on him like daggers. His son was gone. These people were telling him how sorry they were for his loss. They didn't know loss. They were going to climb into their vehicle with mostly complete partners and go back to their homes so they could hug their own children and be glad it wasn't them who'd lost someone important. They would put the funeral announcements in a drawer by the door where they kept their keys or their change, and one day they would drag it out by mistake and think how sad it had been that such a youngster had died in the prime of his life. Then they would throw it away or put it in another drawer, and they would probably never think about it again. He seethed over these thoughts as he sat in the hard plastic chair provided by Copeland Funeral Home. He seethed over these people and their routine, unbroken lives until he was the only one there. Then John got up and he went home. John sat and watched TV, eating his TV dinner without much enthusiasm. The turkey was lumpy and had only cooked in the middle. The mashed potatoes were still half frozen, the gravy like liquid lava. On TV, the news anchor was talking about the Green Man murders. The latest victim, Shelley Rhodes, had been discovered in an alley. The police were looking for someone who might have seen the perpetrator. John watched apathetically as he spooned the mush into his mouth. A commercial came on for Anders Tires, and he tuned it out. Malcolm had been dead for 3 days, and John had done little but wallow in his misery. The house was like a monument to better times. He had stood in the entryway most of the afternoon after the funeral, staring at photos of him and Malcolm at the beach. Claire had taken it after they built that sandcastle they were both hunkered over. They had been at the shore for a week. Malcolm was as brown as a nut after spending 6 days on the beach. The castle had begun as a lopsided thing before John had gotten involved. Malcolm had bought the shoddy plastic molds at the beachside stand, and John had known a thing or two about sandcastle building. Together, they had constructed an elegant castle, complete with drawbridge and moat. The turrets had grown out of the sand, the flags had been leaves plucked from a nearby tree. Claire had been laughing as she snapped the photo, and the two of them had been grinning like fools over this accomplishment. John felt tears fall from his eyes, saw them tumble into his unappetizing mashed potatoes, and spooned them into his mouth anyway. Malcolm's room was the worst part of the house. The room stood at the very top of the staircase, easily viewable from the downstairs landing. John had stood in the dark last night and just looked at the doorway from the bottom step. The nightlight cast the scene in a strange shadowverse. He could vaguely see the baseball players trapped in their glory as they hung glossily from the wall by pushpins. He could see the bookshelf where John had taken his son's nightly bedtime story. He could see the balsa wood glider where it hung from the ceiling, the broken wing mocking him. How many times had John promised to fix it? How many times had he told Malcolm he would go buy a tube of airplane glue? How many times had he gone to the store and not done it? He had thought he had time. He had thought he could do it some other when. He had been wrong. He had slept in his recliner every night after that. The phone rang then, dragging him from his misery. The picture on the screen was that of his wife, smiling like she was the happiest woman in the world as Malcolm grinned from her hugging arms. John felt a sob creep up his throat. He would have to change that. He answered it on the 6th ring, saying hello without much enthusiasm. "Hi, John." His wife sounded tired. She sounded like maybe she had been crying, too. She sounded like John felt, ready to just give up and join their son in his eternal rest. John found he didn't have much of a feeling about that. "Hi, Claire. You didn't come to see me today." He didn't have an answer for that.
so he said nothing. "Are you okay, John? I'm worried about you." John thought about the question. He was not, he decided, okay, but if he told his wife this, she would worry. He hadn't come to see her today for that reason. Not for the reason that he suspected that she suspected, which was that he blamed her for his son's death. He no more blamed Claire than he blamed the car she had totaled when a semi-truck, driven by a man who was asleep at the wheel, had crushed their car against the guardrail. He didn't blame her for that. It was an event outside her control. He didn't come to see her because she would look at him and know that something was deeply wrong with him. She would see the dark circles, the pallid skin, the dirty face cleaned only by the tears that seemed to run tirelessly, and she would worry. He didn't care about any of that. Not really. But if she told a doctor about these things, John might spend the next few months as a drooling zombie while they pumped him full of dope. John did not want to dope his pain away. He wanted to wallow in it, like a pig wallows in filth. "John, are you mad at me?" He could hear the tears on the verge of bursting. "No, Kay, I'm just tired," he said, using her pet name. "I haven't slept well since..." His own tears slid out again, pale tracks of moisture that always seemed on the verge of falling. "Since the funeral. I wanted to be there for you, and for him, but I know," he lied. John knew very little that he was confident of these days. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay, John. I wish I were there to help you through this. I wish you were here to help me through this." She was crying now. He could almost hear her tears as they slid against the phone. He stared at the TV like a husk, incapable of feeling empathy for his sobbing wife. "I know, but someone has to pay the bills. Now more than ever." "That was a crock," said a voice in his brain. John had no more been to work than he had been upstairs. Mr. Beadle had given him bereavement, and he had taken it without a fight. He had done little more than sit morosely and fulfill his body's needs when they clawed against his consciousness. Feed the machine, empty the tank, sleep, rinse, repeat. It was all becoming very tedious. "You sound tired. I'll let you get to sleep. Will I see you tomorrow?" "Yeah," he said, lying again. "I'll swing by after work and see how you're doing." "I'd like that. I miss you, John. I love you." "I love you too, Kay." The lies came easily. He hung up the phone and continued to wallow. "Are you happy?" asked the man on the TV. He was a tall fellow, sleek black hair, thin mustache that looked oily. He was wearing a butcher's apron over a white shirt and smiling into the camera like he could see through John's TV. It was a little unsettling. John kept watching, figuring the commercial would be over soon. "Feeling empty? Perhaps seeking something you've lost?" John shoveled more food into his mouth, but felt his eyes locked on the greasy salesman. "Here at Bright Farm, we pride ourselves on helping those who are lost come back into the light. Whatever you're seeking, you can be sure that we have it here at Bright Farm. Our counselors are here 24/7 to..." John lifted the remote, a job that seemed harder than it should have, and flipped over to the next channel. "Make sure the light does not escape you in your time of need." What in the hell? It was the same commercial. He clicked over again. "Maybe you've recently had a crisis of faith, suffered an event that's made you question the existence of a bright and shining God. Maybe you've lost your way, no longer feeling that life is worth living." John had changed the channel 7 times while the man was talking, but found him on every channel. For some reason, the man was making him uncomfortable, and he wanted to see anything on the tube at that point. A baseball game, an old movie, a stupid sitcom, anything but this man and his smiling, stupid face. As he watched, the smile seemed to stretch under that mustache, and as he clicked the button to turn the set off, he realized that the man's eyes were fixed directly on him. The man was staring at him through the TV. The veins in his eyes seemed to be pulsating as John watched. Maybe you've even lost someone you loved. A mother, a brother. His eyes got very intense, and no matter how many times he hit the off button, the TV stayed on. A son. He was staring right at him now, and clearly only at him. He's here, John. He's here, and all you have to do is come to him. What are you waiting for, John? Why are you just sitting there, John? He misses you, John. The man was screaming from the TV. John was aware that his dinner was leaking into his sweatpants. He had upset the little plastic tray, but it hardly seemed to matter. The man on the TV was beating his fists against the glass front and yelling at John, questioning him, asking him why he didn't come to his son if he missed him so damn much. John was screaming as he did this, and he came awake all at once. The screen was snow, and he had indeed spilled his dinner. He turned off the television, cleaned up his chair, and thought longingly about going up to bed. It took him only a few minutes at the bottom of the stairs to return to his recliner. He slept fitfully that night. John woke up early the next morning, bright and early. This was something he seemed to be unable to shake from his old life. His job had expected him to arrive at 8 a.m. every day, and his brain seemed hardwired to wake up at 6 a.m. every morning. He thought about going to work. Maybe a day at the office would set him right. He could sit in his office and go over accounts and feel like his usual self. He could pretend that when 5 o'clock came around, he could go home to his loving wife and his best buddy in their 2-bedroom, 2-bath home. And when he got off and drove home, he would find it just that way. He only stood at the foot of the stairs for 20 minutes, seeing the pennants on the wall and watching the broken plane hanging suspended from the ceiling before turning away and going to the kitchen instead. There would be no normal life for him. Never again. The round cereal clinked into the bowl cheerily. The box declared it was Space Acers, and it was Malcolm's favorite cereal. The marshmallows stood out amongst the grain circles. They were the kind of neon color that only a kid could love, the lumpy multicolor of poor craftsmanship and lack of real care. He saw a tear fall into them as he studied them. He remembered how Malcolm had sung the jingle every time he ate them. He remembered how Malcolm could name all 7 different marshmallow shapes, remembering when he'd gotten so excited over that Captain Acer's decoder ring that he'd found in the box last year. He saw another tear roll into the cereal and turned to get the milk. He opened the door and scanned the pristine white glow of the refrigerator for the carton. He was momentarily worried that it was out of date, but suddenly the happy cow face came into view. When he picked it up, he got a nasty shock as he realized that Bright Farm Dairy was printed over the head of the smiling cow. Had that always been his milk provider? He was sure it had been a different company last week. He turned the carton, reading the side description, feeling a kind of surreal haze roll over him. It told how Bright Farm cows were the happiest cows in the world. It told how Bright Farm was the leading provider of dairy for his area. Then he turned the carton and felt it slip out of his numb fingers. As it fell, he could clearly see the missing child picture side of the carton. The black and white photo made it hard to make out his exact features, but John would know the boy's sandy brown hair and green eyes, even in black and white. He was smiling, as he had been in the beach picture, and under the picture was the legend, "Found child, answers to Malcolm, misses his father, wants to know why his father hasn't come to get him, wants to know why his father doesn't love him." The milk puddled on the ground as his son's face stared up at him from the floor. He felt the tears patter into the pool as he looked down at the spilled milk. "What do you mean you're out of milk?" John had been to 3 different stores, and each of them had been out of milk. The first 2 had had little signs taped over the milk coolers saying, "Sorry, they were out of milk." There had been no one to yell at there, but he had found someone to yell at when he reached the 3rd store. The man in the plastic apron bore it well, clearly not the first irate customer today, and flashed his pasted-on grin in the face of John's ire. "Sorry, sir, but the company had a little trouble with their trucks today. You could try another store, I suppose, but I'm guessing they're all in the same boat." Smug prick, John thought. He knew they were all in the same boat. "You could always go down to Bright Farm and get the milk yourself," the man added, taking a step away as though trying to distance himself from the conversation. John watched him go, breathing out disgustedly as he went back to the parking lot to find his car. He guessed he was going to Bright Farm. Bright Farm looked almost idyllic. John had driven for almost an hour, making his way out of the city's hustle and bustle and into the more rural areas surrounding the town. Here was the farm belt, the farms with acres of land, all planted with vegetables in neat rows, or with livestock happily munching grass in the field. John saw big red barns and farmhouses with long porches, people moving about between them as they went about their daily lives. The road ran on, and when his GPS said he had arrived, he almost didn't believe it. The farm had seemed like a strange place in the infomercial, some kind of farm akin to a backwoods gospel tent, where miracles happened, or at least they claimed they did. This place, though, looked like the farm in the Hidden Valley commercials. The road turned left onto a hard-packed dirt track. John could see fields ripe with produce, an orchard in the distance with happy pickers at work, a long pair of barns for cows or sheep maybe, and several tall wooden houses that looked almost Amish. The sign over the road said, "Bright Farm," in cheery white letters. The place seemed downright peaceful, downright wholesome. John turned his car down the road and drove towards the cluster of buildings. There were 8 two-story buildings of dark brown wood, with heavy windows that looked down from them. To John, they looked like disapproving eyes. Among them, as though surrounded, was a squat little building with a long porch complete with rockers. A sign hung across the roof declaring it to be the General Store. John thought it was as good a place as any for some information, so he mounted the steps and went inside. The bell tinkled overhead merrily. The inside was a packed but orderly arrangement of everything one might need for frontier life at the turn of the century. There were long shelves stacked with sacks of bean and corn, flour and sugar, bolts of cloth and spools of thread, and an overwhelming smell of brine that led him to a huge pickle jar near the front of the door. Behind a long counter stood a man in a butcher's apron, his dark hair and small mustache looking eerily familiar, wearing the biggest smile John had ever seen. He stared intently at John, and the attention made John's skin crawl. "Good morning, stranger. Are you here for the milk?" I guess so," John said. The man cocked his big smiling head and said, "Pardon me for saying so, sir, but you don't really seem too sure." I seem to be drawn here for some reason lately. I see your commercials and your products, and they seem to be calling me here." The man cocked his head to the other side, then snapped his fingers loudly. "I thought you looked familiar. You're John, right?" John jumped a little. How did you know my name?" "Oh, we've been waiting for you. We've been keeping something extraordinary for you. It's in the barn. Come on." The shopkeeper went off into the room behind the counter, beckoning John as he left. John felt drawn to follow him, but as he stepped, he contemplated. Was he really going to just follow the stranger into the back of his store? These people clearly wanted him here for some reason. Why give them what they wanted? Unless they might actually have. "Coming?" called a voice from the back. John was around the counter before he could stop himself. He followed the man into the back of the store, a shadowy mountain of creaking shelves, but to his surprise, the man in the apron was already standing by an open back door. He led him out into the bright dooryard and pointed to a long cowshed he had seen before. If he had thought it looked too big from the road, now it seemed to stretch off towards the field for far too long. It wasn't just the length either. The shed looked odd somehow. It looked like the kind of place that held secrets best left unfounded, like a freak show tent or the back room of a snake handler's revival. John hesitated as the man took a step towards the sheds, not wanting to know what lay inside. The man looked back cheerily. "Don't you want to see what we have for you? He's been waiting for so long." "Who?" John asked, but the man was already walking towards the shed, and John had to step quickly to catch up. The shed door creaked open ominously as the shopkeeper slid it to the side. He reached inside and fumbled against the wall with a loud snap, signaling the lights to life. They clicked on rapidly, lighting overhead, fluorescence snapping on in a quick pattern that lit the small wooden berth in the long cowshed. As they stepped inside, the man walked briskly, and John tried to follow as his curious eyes also tried to take in what lay inside of each berth. Most were people, confused and naked as they sat in the straw, but some were full of objects or money or precious items. The worst was the shadowy stall that held things with red eyes and furtive breaths. They huddled in the darkness and looked at him as he went past. Their eyes held no recognizable emotion except hate. After a minute of quick walking, they came to a stop. The man extended his hand towards a closed stall. "This is it. Hurry up. He's waiting for you." John was a few steps behind him, the berth next to this one holding a smashed-up Mercedes. When he heard the man speak, his voice echoing in this strangely quiet place, John shivered a little. He didn't want to disturb the things here, many of which were rather disturbing on their own. John didn't want to know what might happen if they suddenly decided to leave their stalls and come out where they could get at him. As he came up to the gate of the berth in question, he could see a small, naked boy of about 10 sitting on the floor, his knees hugged up to his chest. A head of sandy blonde hair was visible between his knees, and John felt his breath stick in his chest. The hair was soft, baby fine, and looked recently washed. It sat artlessly on top of his small head, just as Malcolm's always had. John felt the tears slide down his face as he remembered how it had poked out underneath his baseball cap when he pulled it down to get it out of his face. Then the boy looked up with those 2 green eyes, and John saw Malcolm smile at him from the straw-strewn floor. "Daddy?" the boy asked, as though he didn't quite dare believe it. It was too much. John felt his knees unhinge, and suddenly he was falling into darkness as the naked boy rose from the floor and came to peek at him through the stall door. The last thing he saw before he blacked out were those 2 green eyes as they bored into him. He came awake with those eyes staring at him. Someone had put him in a bed. The sheets were soft and luxurious, but the blankets were like sandpaper as he lay atop them. The boy perched on his chest was digging into him painfully, and as he woke up, the boy smiled and crawled to snuggle under the blanket. He wrapped his small arms around him and noticed the uncomfortable fabric not at all. John felt the comfortable press of his son's as he lay beside him. How many days had he woken up just like this? Malcolm pressed between him and his wife as they slept together, his warm comfort against John's back as he warmed in between them. John wrapped his own arms around him and breathed in the scent of fabric softener, off-brand shampoo his wife bought for them, and the warm grass that always seemed to hang around his son. John opened his eyes. He expected to wake up in his own bed, the dream evaporating around him, but Malcolm was still there. The door opened then. The man from behind the counter walked in, his hard boots knocking on the wooden floor, and he smiled his too wide smile at John. "You're awake," he stated. John sat up and put a protective arm around his son. The boy was dressed in a pair of overalls, a blue shirt beneath, but John saw that he was still wearing the clothes he had arrived in. The room was Spartan, a bed and an end table being their only real elements, and as the smiling man towered over them, John began to feel self-conscious. He slid out of bed, Malcolm still clinging to him, and faced the man. "How is it that you came to have my son?" The man shrugged. "The farm knows what people want. It knows what people need. One day I was sweeping up, and he was just sitting there. He looked up with those big green eyes and asked where his daddy was, and I just knew that sooner or later you'd come looking for him." John ruffled the boy's hair. "I'm glad I did. It seems like everything lately was trying to bring me here." "Are you hungry?" the smiling man asked suddenly. "Margaret is just about to have lunch ready, and she'd be tickled pink if you'd join us." John looked down at Malcolm's 2 green eyes and smiled. "Sure, why not?" They spent the rest of the day together. After lunch, Thomas took them down to feed day-old bread to the ducks in the little pond. Thomas, the smiling man, had finally introduced himself. As he and his wife, a smiling plump woman of middle age, had fed them from their table, John couldn't take his eyes off of Malcolm. The boy dug into the meal just as his boy always had, like it might be the last one he ever had. And when Margaret offered him a piece of pie, The boy's eyes lit up with excitement. How many birthdays had John seen that same excitement cross his face as the cake came out? Malcolm caught John staring at him and smiled shyly as Margaret added a big scoop of ice cream to go with it. After the ducks, Malcolm noticed a playground in the town commons. He drugged John to a small clearing with wooden climbing courses and metal antiques that spun and bobbled. As John sat and watched, other kids came over to play with Malcolm in that effortless way that children often do. Watching Malcolm play, running during tag or jumping or loping during their make-believe games, filled John with a curious mixture of hope and dread. He hoped this would never end. He hoped he had crashed his car on the way to the farm and this was heaven, and that he could simply sit here and watch his boy play for the rest of his days. At the same time, he dreaded when this would have to end, and his sadness would creep back as the delusion or dream or whatever it was finally ended. It's best not to think too hard about that, John. John jumped. Thomas had seated himself next to him, the stretched skin on his mouth still fashioned in that rictus of a smile that, up close, seemed almost painful. Why did he smile like that if the act hurt him? He tried to find his words, but they all seemed to muddy in his mind in the face of that bitter smile. To think about what? How he can be, or how he came to be here. He is here. He's your son, and it's best not to think about it. John watched him as though he might vanish if he looked away. We can make a place for you here, Thomas continued. A place for you and Malcolm. You can be part of this community and know the blessing of the bright, as we all do. John snapped his gaze back to Thomas. I'm sorry, what are you talking about? Thomas put his old worn hands on his knees and grinned. Well, you're here now. We have to find the two of you a place in our community. Why would I do that? John asked, genuinely perplexed. Well, you can't leave. The two of you have to stay. John felt himself growing angry, but tried to keep it in check. This man had given him an irreplaceable gift, and it wouldn't be good manners to shout at him. Are you trying to tell me that we can't leave? Thomas shrugged. Of course not. You're free to leave at any time. But Malcolm, he is of the bright. You can't take him away from here. It would be cruel to do so. Malcolm ran up about that time, his face flushed with excitement. Daddy, some of the kids want to know if we'll attend service with them this evening. Can we go? It sounds like fun. John collected Malcolm into his arms then and stood towering over the smiling Thomas. No, son. I think it's time we left. Your mother will never believe it when I show you to her. But just the thought of sharing Malcolm made John feel strange. Thomas seemed unperturbed by John. I wouldn't do that, friend. It never ends well. Just leave us alone. All of you, just leave us alone, John said, backing away. He was running by the time he made it to the parking lot. Malcolm's familiar weight carried effortlessly. John's car was conspicuously absent. He had thought it was some kind of illusion. The tan-colored car would appear when he got a little closer. But now, he saw that even the ruts he had left in the dirt were gone. The car was missing. He was left with few options for escape. He turned towards the road and saw the quaint wooden gate rising in the distance. It could have been 50 feet. It could have been 50 miles. John didn't care. As the sun set at his back, he began to walk towards the gate. Daddy, don't. I feel sick, Malcolm whined. John ignored him, clinging to him as he jogged for the gate. He could flag down a car once they made it to the road. After all, this was a busy road, and a passing trucker or traveler would take them back to the city. They could be home by bedtime. Malcolm could sleep in his own bed, beneath the watchful eye of his baseball posters and his Star Wars ships that hung from the ceiling by fishing line. Daddy! Malcolm's voice sounded hoarse. The dirt puffed under his feet as he jogged. With every step, he expected a torch-bearing mob to rise up to block their path. They wouldn't want him to take this miracle child from them, something that should not exist, and they would fight to stop him from leaving. He would fight them. They would kill him, but he would fight them. He would die, but his last image would be of Malcolm as he, Stop it! I feel sick, Daddy! I don't want to leave! I want to! I want to. Malcolm became dead weight in his arms as he jogged. The stile came up before him, and he hefted the child in his arms as he ran. Malcolm was heavy, his skin clammy. Something like sweat or tears dampened John's shirt as he ran. He was suddenly fearful. What if they had poisoned him? What if they had done something to Malcolm so he couldn't leave? He finally looked down at his precious son and screamed into what had once been Malcolm's face. John found he was holding something akin to a lump of clay in his arms, just like a child's approximation of a person. The arms were thick and lumpy, the body little more than a badly formed torso of androgynous humps. The head was malformed, its eyes and mouth little more than scooped out holes with tufts of hair shoved hastily into the muck. When it turned its face to him and spoke, Malcolm rasped out garbled words full of pain and confusion. John felt that he must surely be going mad. He fell to his knees, the gates within arm's reach, and wept into the bulbous chest of Malcolm's newly formed body. This was unbearable. To lose his son again, and in such a way as this, was unthinkable. He couldn't recover from this. If this was really some dream, then this would be the part where he would wake up screaming into his pillow. Things like this didn't happen under the eyes of a loving God. There was only so much pain a man could take before he broke completely. He knelt in the dirt and sobbed into the mushy chest of his twice-lost son, praying for insanity, praying for an end to understanding. It was dark when Thomas found them. John didn't shudder or even acknowledge him when he put a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to him, and in the moonlight, his smile looked ghoulish. "Why?" John croaked, his face awash with the muddy flesh of his still croaking boy. "Why?" Thomas only shook his head, grinning. "I tried to tell you, friend. The gifts of Bright Farm are only for those who accept the bright. The miracles experienced here are not for the outside world. If you want to stay with Malcolm, then you must stay near the bright." John turned back to the odd boy thing. He stared at it for a long time. "If I accept this bright, my son will be returned to me?" "As he was before," Thomas assured. John looked away, and in the moonlight his martyr's mask was ghastly with the mush of his son's chest. "Show me." Thomas took him by the hand. He led John towards the chapel that lay beyond the cowshed. Inside, a sun seemed to shine only for those within. As they approached, John could feel it baking him and felt the warmth fill him. He felt his fear, his anger, his sadness, and all his doubt burned from him. Someone by the wooden door took the boy shape from him, and at that moment he barely noticed. He had discovered something new, something old. As the doors were opened and the baking bright shone over him, he felt his lips pulled into a painful smile. The bright was all he ever needed, the thing he wanted but never knew. He was burned anew by the bright, and it was good. The van pulled up in the dirt parking lot of the little community. The ramp came down, and the sandy-haired woman rolled her wheelchair onto the metal slab. As it descended, she began looking at the gawking faces that had gathered to see her descent. She had used a wheelchair since the accident, but she refused to let it stop her. Even if she had to crawl, she wouldn't have allowed it to stop her from finding John. For 6 months, she'd recovered in the hospital alone. For 6 months, he had ignored her phone calls. When the bank had called to let her know that her mortgage hadn't been paid in 6 months, she was worried. When the police called her to tell her her husband's car had been found abandoned on the stretch of road leading up to this place, she was terrified. When her friend Lisa had seen him at the farmer's market, selling quilts and homegrown vegetables, she was furious. He had abandoned their old life to find himself in the country, it seemed, leaving her in the ICU to fight for her life and worry about him as he slid into silence. She meant to find him and make him answer for his absence. The wheels of the chair didn't much care for the dirt path that led up to the 2-story houses that seemed to be the living quarters of this little community. The man on the phone had told her that John lived in the house closest to the playground, and as she rolled towards that playground, she felt her arms grow stiff and non-compliant. She sat in the dirt road and gawked at the perfect, sandy-haired boy that was now standing atop the play structure and laughing with the other overall-clad children. Malcolm. It was Malcolm. He looked at her then, and she saw recognition dawn on his face. He jumped from the structure, landing in that way that seems the providence of only children and drunks, and ran to her with guileless joy. He buried his face against her chest, rubbing his soft hair against her, and fixed her with those deep green eyes that had enchanted her since birth. It was him, in the flesh, and as he hugged her, she could no more summon the strength to hug him back than she could have summoned the strength to strangle him to death. "Mommy! Mommy! I missed you!" She saw a man rise from the bench, and through his tangled beard she could see it was John. He was smiling, his face a rictus of pleasured pain. His mouth smiled, but as she saw his eyes, she felt a stab of pain rip through her heart. His eyes were pinched, screaming, and as he approached, he seemed to be begging her to run. He bent to hug her, melding against his son easily as the two embraced her like some lost relation who had come back again. How is this possible, John? He smiled at her with that painful grin. "Come to the barn, Claire. All things can be found if you're willing to see the light." Something hot to drink, I think, would be just the thing for today. Maybe some tea, or maybe a little coffee, though it would definitely interfere with my nap. It would make a great segue into our next story, about someone who has something to drink, but it might be a little more than they thought it was going to be. So, I hope you've brought your own cup for today's serving of black coffee. I don't know what I'm going to do. They won't stop pounding on the door. They won't stop calling my name. And before long, someone with keys is going to come along and unlock my office. I don't know what to do. Completely out of my element here. And all my brain can come back to is that coffee. The coffee. The goddamn coffee. "First cup of the morning?" he'd asked, and all I could do was smile at him. He must be new. Because if he'd been here longer than a week, he'd know how often I show up to this machine. I stood before the coffee pot like a worshiper at the altar, and as the savory black liquid spilled into the pot, I felt my mouth water at the thought of coffee. First cup. Yeah, right. I started my day with the taste of warm, fresh brewed coffee. As I'd cooked my breakfast, I'd had another, savoring this one a little, as I never did the first cup. And as I sat down to catch up on my emails, I drank a third as I ate my breakfast. I'd had another one on the way to work, savoring the aroma as I sat in traffic, and now it was time to get a cup before I sat down for another day of work. First cup. Try fifth. I've been like this since my late teens. My mother was a career nurse who drank coffee by the pot, not the cup. As a single mother trying to keep up with an active son, there was never a time I can't remember when coffee wasn't part of our lives. When I was just a tyke, my mom was always running late due to my inability to get moving in the morning. No one wants to lose their job because their kid can't get ready on time, so one morning, she gave me a sippy cup of coffee, sweetened with milk and sugar. No surprise, I took to it like a fish to water. The other parents looked at her funny when she told them. She heard the usual sermons about how coffee would stunt my growth and make me hyper, but she always felt she knew better. The fact that I was never prone to hyperactivity and grew to top out about 6 feet seemed to have proven their worries were groundless. Coffee is life for me. It runs through my veins, and I always joke that when I die, I'm going to donate my body to Starbucks. I can be their flavor of the month. That cup looks a little rough, don't you think? I turned to see Chuck wander into the break room then, unrecognizable health smoothie in his My Body is a Temple shaker cup. The new guy greeted him as he came in, and I extended my hand for a fist bump. As he met my knuckles with his, I couldn't help but shudder a little at how scaly and clammy his skin always is. You'd think with all that rabbit food he ate that those healthy shakes would make his skin a little softer, or at least clear up his skin condition. It's got character, Chuck, unlike whatever you're drinking there. Chuck laughed. If character is what you call mushrooms growing in the bottom of that thing. He was right. Not about the mushrooms, but about the state of my cup. I'd had this cup for 3 years, and in that time I had never once bothered to wash it. The outside was a little stained up, but otherwise looked pretty normal. The inside, however, was a dark cauldron of old coffee stains and filth. It didn't look that bad to me, but, of course, I had gotten used to it by now. I always justified it by telling myself that I was putting boiling water into it, so anything living in there was likely to get boiled out of existence by the time I got around to drinking the coffee. I had no idea what I was setting myself up for. The hot liquid splashed into the cup with a luxuriant sound. I swirled the contents around in the cup before taking a test sip and gasping in pain. It was much too hot, but I had known that already. I talked with Chuck a few more minutes, and when Mr. Ryan strode into the break room, we all said our goodbyes and left for our desks. Mr. Ryan's was a fantastic boss, but he had a very narrow opinion on dawdling and socializing on company time. I said hi to a few other people on my hall and stopped at Rob's door to pass a few words. He was hard at it already, and I could see his tongue sticking out through his teeth, a nervous habit he said he'd had since elementary school. His dark hair looked sweaty, and when I asked him if he was okay, he said he had to make an 8 o'clock deadline, but maybe he could catch up at lunch. I said that sounded great, and as I walked to my office, I saw that Lisa was already behind her computer as well. Lisa was a mousy new girl that had moved into the office across from mine a few months ago. She was about my age, with straight brown hair that she always piled neatly on her head, and she had a cute pair of black glasses that were constantly needing to be pushed up the bridge of her nose. She didn't say much, but we waved at each other most mornings, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't have just a little bit of a crush on her. She waved back, smiling in her shy way, and went back to work as I stepped into my office and closed the door. I sat the coffee on my desk and turned on my computer as I prepared to start another day. I'm an IT specialist, so my job is mostly fixing other people's problems. There was an email already from Janice about how her monitor wouldn't come on, and another from Steven about how his issues with the network had gotten out of hand again. I sipped my coffee as I read these, testing the hot liquid with my lips before committing to the sip. I reached for the phone so I could call Janice. Janice was a frequent caller. The IT guy before me had thought it was funny to give her the most ancient of our relic computers. I'd been keeping that dinosaur running for years now, and every time the budget committee told me they didn't have enough money for a new computer, I died a little inside. I called Steven, and after a few questions it became apparent that his problem was of his own making again. He'd opened another questionable email, and now his computer wouldn't link to the network. That was by design. Steven was notorious for opening anything that found its way into his inbox. He'd brought the network down several times with this sort of behavior, and I logged in remotely to revert it to a previous state, which solved the problem. The virus hadn't been that aggressive, it seemed, and he thanked me for helping him. I reached for my cup and found that it was empty. I'd been sipping the coffee while I was on the phone with Steven, and I'd drank more than expected, I guess. I called Janice and asked her what was going on with her computer, and after a few sentences, I reached into the drawer and found a new power cord. The computers seemed to burn through them for some reason, and I'd recently made a note to keep them in stock. I locked my computer, grabbed my coffee cup, and figured I'd stop for a fresh cup on the way to Janice's office. I stepped out into the hallway, turned left, and stopped dead in my tracks. My cup shattered on the carpeted floor, and that drew the creature's attention at the end of the hallway. It was hideous. It had a bulbous gray head that was covered in coarse black hair, and the small white eyes that dotted its head were awful looking. Its jaw lolled open to reveal a mouthful of sewing needle teeth and a flicking red tongue that constantly moved over them. It was dressed in a white button-up shirt and a pair of black slacks, but the shirt bulged with coarse black hair, and the pants looked to be barely containing its oddly shaped legs. It looked at me, and for a second, eyes blinked in an odd succession before it raised a hand to ask if I was okay. I shuddered and felt my knees unhinge as I slid to the wall. It sounded like Rob. Rob's voice was coming out of this creature's mouth, and as it did, I could feel my mind slipping a little. What the hell was going on? Had I been drugged? Were they playing a trick on me? As the Rob creature made its way up the hall, I saw another thing stick its head out of the break room. It looked like an enormous bat head stuck in a business suit, and in one clawed, scaly hand, it held something that looked like Chuck's smoothie shaker. He didn't even look real. The creature looked like a photorealistic movie monster, or images from a horror site when someone has drawn creatures that just look a little too real. As the Rob creature got closer, I could see small sores on its skin, long curly hairs sprouting in places between its eyes, and I felt a scream ripping its way up my throat. The Chuck creature blinked his two big eyes at me. "What's wrong? You okay?" It came blundering out of the break room and towards me, and I felt my legs finally take orders as I backpedaled towards the exit door. It was 30 feet away, down several hallways, but I felt like I was motivated enough to run a mile in a minute flat. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong, and until I knew what was going on, I wasn't sure I could trust any of my senses. I had come to my office door when my back met resistance, and I realized I had bumped into someone. I turned my head woodenly to see what new horror I had blundered into, and I felt a fresh scream rip through me. It was a spider, a giant spider, but with a body on top of its abdomen like some fantasy creature from a video game. Its torso was vaguely feminine, breasts poking from beneath a blue cardigan that hung over its shoulders. Its 8 chitinous legs clicked on the floor as it took a step backwards to assess me. It looked at me with familiarity, and I could see that it had shiny black hair piled on its head above its 8 rotating eyes. 2 eyes seemed to be covered by thin metal glasses, and I blundered towards my door as I realized who it was. The spider thing was Lisa. "Sorry, are you okay? I didn't mean to." I didn't let her finish. I pushed my way into my office and slammed the door behind me. I locked the handle, pushed my chair under it, and cringed against the farthest wall I could get to. What in the hell was going on? Had that been real? What was I seeing out there? That couldn't be my colleagues. Could it? They had sounded like them, even sort of acted like them. But the creatures out there had been so nightmarish that I couldn't even process it. All I could do was huddle under my desk, knees pulled up to my chest, and try not to cry as someone knocked on the door. "You okay in there?" It was Chuck. "You scared Lisa half to death, man. I think she's crying in her office right now. Maybe you could come apologize?" I stiffened. Lisa was crying. Had I done that? I couldn't bear the thought that I had made Lisa cry. I had half risen from under my desk when I'd finally gotten a hold of myself again. This wasn't real. The monsters were trying to trick me so they could get me out of my office. I sat back down under my desk and squeezed my knees against my chest again. They wouldn't trick me like that. I wasn't going to be fooled so easily. Chuck banged on the door, harder this time, and asked what my problem was. Rob's voice made an appearance as well, and he apologized for startling me. They were worried about me and wanted me to come out so they could sort through this. They were scared for me and wanted to see me. They got angry at how I was acting and started banging louder all the while. I just huddled under my desk and sobbed quietly. I couldn't process what was going on or why this was happening. And all the avenues seemed to come back to the coffee. Someone had drugged me. Someone was messing with me. Someone had done this to make me freak out. But why? That was when the phone rang. It jangled merrily in the cradle, unaware of the horror show that was just outside the door. I looked up over the edge of my desk like a cartoon mouse peeking out of his hole. I almost expected the phone to grow fangs or sprout eyes, but it didn't. It just continued to be an average black plastic phone. I reached out shakily for it, and as my sweaty hands settled around it, I felt it solidify and had second thoughts about my perception. My desk was still here. My computer still hummed peacefully. If this was a world for monsters, then how could all these things exist? How would a monster type with big clawed hands? How would he sit in a normal chair? How would he pick up the phone? As I picked up the phone, I heard Mr. Ryan's calm voice wash over me. It took me a minute to realize that he was calling my name as I was just sitting there in the calm warmth of my realization. "Hello, sir?" I said, and my voice shook a little. "Are you okay?" His voice was calm and rich and made me feel like control had been restored. I don't know, sir. I'm seeing some weird stuff. Have you imbibed any substances today? It's okay if you have. I just want to know how we can help you. I just had a cup of coffee in the break room and coffee at home. I was fine when I got here, sir, and now I don't know what's going on. I'll be there in a few minutes. Just wait. And he hung up before I could tell him about the monsters. I hung up the phone and sat huddled under my desk. He wouldn't be able to get here, not with the monsters out there, and even if he could, would he be normal? Maybe this was just another trick by the monsters. I sat under my desk, shuddering and waiting for the creatures to break down my door and get me. They had stopped banging and shouting, but I could still hear them scuttling around out there. They were waiting, just waiting for me to drop my guard. Then they'd have me. 4 loud knocks made me jump and hit my head on the desk. "It's Mr. Rhines. Open the door, please, so we can talk about this." I slunk from under my desk, looking for all the world like a scared rabbit as I approached the door like I thought it might explode. Are the monsters gone?" He didn't answer right away, probably hoping he had misheard me. "Monsters?" I put my mouth close to the door jamb and whispered, "The monsters are out in the hall." No monsters. Why don't you let me in so we can talk about all this and get everything straightened out? Your friends and co-workers are worried about you and are anxious to get this sorted out. My hand shook as I set it on the doorknob. I must have been wrong. Maybe I'd just had a psychotic incident or something. Now everything was back to normal. I had acted like an ass and scared the hell out of everyone. It was time to go face the music, maybe find out what all this was about, and as I wrapped my hand around the knob, I was sure that everything would be back to normal when I opened the door. As the door came open, the worst horror of all was waiting for me. He was a demon. His skin was the color of burnt pork and was awash with cracks and blisters that opened and oozed as he stood before me. His hands were cruel claws sprouting from the cuffs of his Armani suit, and his wings extended like a miasma behind him. His face was a wide, lolling mouth, eyeless and earless, with a massive set of ram's horns that curled above the door jamb as he hulked in it. When he opened his mouth, I heard the voice of Satan himself, the lilting voice that invited Eve to eat an apple, and I knew that I would never be able to deny him if he spoke. "Now, let's see what all this is." I slammed the door in his face, and they've been banging at it for nearly 30 minutes. So here I sit, writing my experience in the hopes that someone will take something from this before they burst through the door and get me. As I write, though, a sobering feeling has occurred to me. There's a mirror in my desk. As I write this, I can't help but look at the drawer and fight the urge to pull it out. As I sit here panicked, afraid that I have somehow found myself in a world of monsters, I never stop to think that maybe the problem is me. Maybe I've lived inside a delusion my whole life. Something in that odd cup of coffee triggered me to see the world for what it really is. Could it be possible that if I were to take that mirror out and look at myself, I could see my own scales and fangs and slime as well? Could it be that somehow the veil has been pulled away and I'm finally seeing the world for what it really is? I guess the lesson here is this: maybe a little soap and water is cheaper than the loss of your own sanity. And maybe I should have listened when they told me to clean my damn cup.
Rain's starting to slack off a little, but I think we've got time for one more story. It's not uncommon to see things. Well, more common for some than others, I suppose. But I think we've all had a strange dream now and again, especially one that might show us something that's likely to happen, or a strange place that we later see and wonder if the dream was prophetic. So be sure not to discount it next time you have a strange vision.
It was one of the most frightening experiences of my life, and I honestly have no explanation for it. My boyfriend and I were on a bit of a road trip, traveling to see my parents the next state over. They had never met him, despite the two of us having dated for almost 2 years. He had proposed to me the week before, my mother seeing the pictures on Instagram, and she had asked when they were finally going to get to meet this mystery boy I intended to marry. I hated that I didn't get to see my mom as much these days. My dad and I had a bit of a falling out before I moved, but he was looking to reconcile, and I was looking for some closure before my marriage to the sweetest man I'd ever met. We were driving, the countryside sliding past, and I felt myself drifting off as I just sat there and took it in. "Feeling like a little nap, babe?" he asked, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "I think I might close my eyes for a second or two." "Well, okay. I'm going to stop for some food soon. 20 winks at the most," he joked. I stuck my tongue out at him and let my eyes slip shut as I blocked out the cows and the green fields that went sliding past the window. When I opened my eyes, the landscape was very different. The sky was red, like burnt red, the color of a jack-o'-lantern, and it seemed to be crackling with heat lightning as I watched. Something was falling from it, something bright that trailed a long tail. They almost looked like comets, but they were too close. We were on the road, but it was pitted and old. The concrete was flaked and peeling, and the landscape was eroded and rocky. Despite this, yellow crops grew from the arid soil, and I could see strange brown creatures with bloated bodies moving along on scaly legs. None of it was right. We should be traveling through Midwestern farmland, and the lightning was rumbling again. I saw it hit the ground and leave a crater amidst the too dry vegetation. I looked to Brad for some kind of answers, but as upsetting as the landscape was, Brad was the most upsetting thing about this, whatever it was. He stared ahead, eyes on the road, as he sat stock still and stared through the window as if it were completely normal. "Brad? What the hell? Where the hell are we?" He stared ahead and said nothing. "Brad, what's going on?" He stared ahead, and as I watched, something seemed to move beneath his cheek. I was scared. He was so still, but I found myself unable to look away. Brad was a joker, but he didn't usually joke like this. This was different. This was making me very afraid, and I started to worry about something being wrong with him. Then, ever so slightly, he turned his head, and I found myself wishing he had just stayed facing forward. His eyes were jet black, too big and starey. His face was locked in the rictus of a smile, and it seemed he was having some sort of fit. His skin was moving, writhing, and as I watched, a large black beetle slid from his mouth and scuttled into his ear. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at me. I became aware of how quiet it was, only the thunder making any noise as it struck outside the window, and the silence was a whole other monster that lurked. It became claustrophobic, like those parts in a horror movie where you're waiting for the monster to scream and scare you so you can just get on with the story. The scream never came. The scare never happened, and I just sat and looked at this thing as it drove us towards wherever we were going. As we sat staring at each other, however, the car was invaded by the sound of a loud, cavernous scream. I turned in time to see our vehicle barreling towards something large and gray that was walking laboriously across the road. I only saw it for a split second, but it was huge, and the thing we were careening towards was a leg that seemed to take up the whole road. Its skin was craggy, like a living mountain, and as it tried to ponderously get its bulk out of the road, we hit it squarely, and the car made a sound like an angry animal. The crash happened in slow motion. The vehicle's front crunched in, lifting us off the ground as the windshield bulged in. The bubble slowly grew before bursting, pushing inward like a rising wave. The glass shattered out like a cascade of beautiful diamonds as it pelted toward my face. Through it all, those dark eyes glared into my soul. He maintained eye contact until I woke up, screaming as the pain radiated up my face. I heard a screech of tires and an angry exclamation from my boyfriend as I came to. The car swerved back onto the road, and I clutched my nose and screamed. The pain was instant and mind-numbing, shooting agony that radiated through my nose and spread through my face. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was going on. Through my tear-streaked eyes, I could see that everything was back to the way it was before I dozed off. Had it all been a dream? My throbbing nose kind of made me think that it had been real. The pain was becoming too much, and I begged him to take me to a hospital. He obliged as best he could, and 20 minutes later, we walked into the ER lobby in the nearest town. It was a slow day, I suppose, because they let us back and asked me questions as I helped them fill out paperwork. They didn't leave us sitting in the room for long either. In no time at all, someone was taking my hand off my face, and my boyfriend was holding my arms to keep me from trying to cover it again. I wanted to cover my face again badly, my nose a white-hot ball of agony, and the touch of Brad's hand was making me shudder. I couldn't look at him, because despite knowing that it was a dream, all I could see was that bug-filled creature with dead eyes looking back at me. The doctor looked into my left nostril with a light and furrowed his brow. That's weird. Hold very still for a second. Brad held me, wrapping his body around me, which only made me shudder worse, as the doctor reached into my nose and pulled something out that seemed to cut me as it came free. My nose hurt all the worse, like it was being sliced with a razor blade, and as it came free of my nose, I could see that it had been what was causing me the pain. It glittered wetly, red drops dappling the edges of the object as it slid out into the light of day. It was a shard of glass, about as long as my pinky tip, and nearly as wide. They had a lot of questions I couldn't answer, and Brad was utterly bewildered as to how it had gotten in my nose in the first place. I can't explain it myself. It was as if I had dozed off perfectly fine and woke up with a huge piece of glass in my face. I told them about the dream, but that didn't seem to convince them in the least bit. I simply gained a giant piece of glass somehow. No one seems to be able to tell me why. That's why I'm writing this, honestly. I sent Brad out to get me some clothes from the car, but I don't know if I can even get back in the car with him. Sometimes he looks normal, but sometimes, just for a second, I can see that weird thing staring out of his face. The other subs I put this in seem to think it was a joke, but you guys seem to appreciate weird stuff, so any advice would be greatly appreciated. I just don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know if I'm going to be able to drive for another 2 hours with him. I don't know what's going on, or if I'll ever get over this. I think that'll just about do it for us today. I'm so glad that you could join me for some great times and some great stories. And I hope you'll come back for more tomorrow. Till then, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful day and a spooky evening.